Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Founders Podcast. Today, we are actually doing a cross post of an episode that I recorded on Gregory Treat's podcast, The Great Houses Forum. His website is greathouses.forum if you're interested in checking that out. Now, I do need to disclaim, Gregory is not a Catholic. He is a Protestant brother of ours, but he is doing some very amazing work. And I can say that I personally have learned a lot of things from him, especially in the realm of building a great house and understanding how we can take back culture, and also just in general, like building family legacy. I've learned a lot from this guy. Now, also, in order to prepare you, I want you to know that I do not agree with all of Greg's points on some of the things that are said in this podcast, so please keep that in mind. Wanted to share this in order to promote further discussion, but please don't take all that said here as an endorsement of Catholic teaching, nor of my opinion. Be sure to check out Greg's show by going to greathouses.forum. By the way, if you guys are not already following us on YouTube, please go give us a subscribe there. We are trying to grow that slowly so that we can eventually get to the point of being monetized. Just look up Catholic Founders on YouTube and give us a follow. If you prefer to watch on YouTube, that's always great too. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Enjoy this cross post of me showing up on Gregory Treat's podcast, The Great Houses Forum.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special, well, this may turn into an episode of the Great Houses Forum. It may not. We'll see. This is I've tentatively titled this Silas Monner Talks Great Houses. So Silas, it's great to have you on. Why don't you give us a little introduction to you and tell us about what you're doing over on the Catholic fraternity side.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Greg. I've learned a lot from your content over the past month, so I appreciate you a lot. The short version for me, the quick history is I'm originally a country boy from Wisconsin, ended up in New York City, met my wife there, then we started having kids, and I was like, yeah, we got to get out of here. So went back to Wisconsin briefly, and then ended up now in Nashville, Tennessee, where I'm building a recruitment consultancy. But the thing that I do and spend a lot of my time on, which I'm very interested in, is this thing called Catholic Founders. It's basically a podcast, newsletter, and you could call it a fraternity or a community of people who are Catholic entrepreneurs. And the core objective is we want to rebuild American culture through, let's call it responsible or godly entrepreneurship. Godly in the sense that entrepreneurship is a co-creative act. It is leaning into to what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God, God who is the creator. And I think that there's like a fundamentally different perspective for our entrepreneurs who are Christian in general when they lean into this idea of being an entrepreneur, because it's not the same as secular entrepreneurs who are just pursuing wealth for wealth's sake, or even impact for impact's sake, which is typically a selfish thing that they're going after. But there's this third dimension, which is Christian entrepreneurship. So that's what we're up to. We've got about 100 people in our community. We publish podcasts and newsletters every week. And right now I've been going off a lot on the new encyclical from the Pope. So you can expect to hear a lot of my opinions probably today might reflect around that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the genesis of this episode was you had reached out to me and asked if I had done any thinking about, lifer employees, long-term, employment relationships. I think in one of the things that this probably needs to be said, there was a point in time in the United States of America where you could expect to get hired out of high school by a corporation, and there was a large amount, maybe not ever a full majority, but a large amount, maybe 30-40% of people in this country that would stay with that corporation until they retired, right? Similar, to a lifer military contract, right? You 20 years, you get a pension, you get a retirement, you have, basically one set of skills that you can hyper optimize in. There was a lot of friction in terms of moving. People didn't want to move. This is, interestingly enough, this is the same time period. One of the key legal markers is of course, the 1960s. When it became illegal discrimination to pay marriage bonuses and first child bonuses. And before that, and I'll note parenthetically that I am aware of anecdotal evidence of managers continuing to pay those bonuses well into the 70s and 80s when it was flat illegal, right? But they would figure out a way to get a guy money when he got married, because if you're trying to make someone into a lifer employee, you actually want them married because it makes them less likely to defect. So Silas, unfortunately, because has not heard, there are certain episodes that will come out before this one, so my audience will have heard my concept of what makes someone likely to defect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a formula that I've been talking about, which is wrong. I'll note that I'm not making a claim that this is a mathematically accurate formula. The formula that I've come up with. So I worked with Grok because I'm an attorney, not a math guy. I worked with Grok to get a very simple formula. Your likelihood of defection is equal to one minus the proof of work you've put into a particular system or thing divided by proof of work plus the benefits of defection, right?
Hmm.
So, and the idea of that is you can, and it's not, again, it's not an exact formula. When I tried to like incorporate research, Grok gave me these super long, like page ending formulas that had all of these different variables in it that I could never explain in a million years. And because I didn't understand them, number one, and because I just don't think that they're explainable to normal people. So there are actual like models out there if you're
Hmm.
genuinely interested in this. The point for my audience that I'm trying to get people to grapple with and engage with is if you want a long-term relationship, you have to be okay with the person you're in a long-term relationship with asking for accountability and some means of reducing your likelihood of defection, which is going to mean you giving up optionality, right?
Hmm.
So one of the things that raises your likelihood of defection is having a plan B, right? I mean, I'm sure in the entrepreneurial world, there's certain entrepreneurs that can work a main job and have a side gig, and that side gig can kind of eventually grow up to replace their income. That I'm not saying that that's impossible, but many, and I'll even say most of the people in my experience, to genuinely make their entrepreneurial thing go, they just had to quit
Yeah.
the other thing they were doing and just say, I'm all in. Because otherwise, every time things get hard in the primary thing that you're doing, well, you just sort of go to the sure money thing and just kind of invest your excess, your marginal time and energy there, because you don't have to make the plan B succeed, right? You don't have to make the side hustle succeed, right? It's sort of the same in the dating markets, right? Your girl, if you're trying to persuade your girl, and now this is happening the other way, right? And because of the depravity of our society, but in historical times, right? If you had another chick on the side, your girl would be very unhappy with you because she would know that if that meant that if she made you unhappy, you would just go with the other girl, right? You
Hmm.
had somebody lined up, and that was seen as negative, right? Now, I don't want to
Yeah.
derail us with a comment of the modern, gender wars. There was a great episode put out by New Founding probably, well, maybe 3 months ago, maybe more than that, talking about the weirdness of the sexual marketplace, right? I mean, the modern apps basically mean that you're competing with all singles in your area. So people are literally competing for the same group of opposite sex members
Hmm.
that their parents and grandparents are competing for, which is very
Hmm.
strange. Probably harder on the women, actually. I think the destructive analog on the
Hmm.
male side is actually when men are competing for the same economic opportunities that their fathers and grandfathers are competing for,
Hmm.
which goes back to this lifer thing, right? If you can be, liquidated, if you can expect to be liquidated every 2 years, well, it makes your incentives very weird, right? So that's sort of my opening lobby, lob across the court. So tell me if what I'm saying is landing, or what
Yeah,
what what
no,
that sparks for you.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think for me, the core motivation, I typically root everything that I'm motivated in by mostly the Catholic social teaching and the things
Sure.
that I've been, raised with. And there's a couple, you could say, tensions with some of those things you've said that I appreciate, are actually important to recognize. But in general, my concern as a Gen Z is that we don't see people investing in their local communities, not because they don't necessarily want to. I would assume it's primarily because they don't see the point, right? So
Right.
on one hand, they think that the government is meant to take care of us and take care of all these things because we no longer have to do it. All the infrastructure was built, in decades prior, so that most things are taken care of and they worked well for a while, and now they're
Hmm.
beginning to fail, and now other people are beginning to take matters into their own hands. I have some perspectives on that, especially at the state level. But in general, I think if you change the incentives, if the companies change the incentives, the people would stick around, right? And obviously, we can talk
Right.
about this in terms of like great families and everything and great houses. But I think that I tend to look at things through the entrepreneurship lens. But I'm just wondering, what are the benefits to society when we get people to stick around for a long time, and how do we make sure that they do have an interest in sticking around and working for us for a long time?
Well, I mean, I was just reading a very interesting article by a Substacker named I don't actually know how to pronounce his last name, so I've been pronouncing it David Ox, Oks, and he did this really interesting article about the difference between Japanese firms, and he calls it the rest of the world's firms. It's really American
Mm-hmm.
post kind of McKinsey quality
Yeah.
consultant American firms, because there's then a different variant in Europe. Europe's kind of setup is still a third thing between the American and the Japanese. But he talks about the fact that the Japanese they heavily invest in their employees getting incredibly optimized for specific technical jobs,
Mm.
right? Which means now once you've invested in that person, you're going to do two things. One is you want to have them be incentivized to work for you for a long time. You kind of need to have work that's specific in that specialty, right? The corporation goes and gets. So let's say you have a skill in America, right? Let's say you have a skill in ceramics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that was the topic of the article. If you have a skill in ceramics in America, in America, if you acquire a skill in ceramics and your company has an industry focus, right? And you kind of there's other industries that can use like the actual specific thing. So like take CAD, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
That'd probably be a more understandable example for most people. If you're really good at CAD, and there's a bunch of different companies that are really good at CAD, right? You're in a surveying company and you use CAD every day. You're a master CAD user and you want to go and spend that same software skill working on 3D printing or some other manufacturing thing, right? You're going to switch companies, right? Of course you are,
Yeah.
right? And that's kind of our default assumption. In Japan, you're not going to switch companies. In Japan, the company is going to open up a new division that employs these people that they've carefully
Mm.
cultivated. And Ox, and I'm going to do a full episode on David Ox here, probably a Substack article or two. The point is that there are actually models that accomplish this, and one of the things that those models produce is chip foundries,
Mm-hmm.
and so Toto, the toilet manufacturer, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're by far their largest division for the past couple of years is this thing that makes really, really flat, like within a couple of microns flat silicon wafers that are
Mm-hmm.
useful for creating RAM chips and all these things, because it's the same machine, right? They have
Yeah.
a group of guys, right, that are really good at doing things with ceramics. And so one of the things you do with ceramics is make toilet bowls, and another thing you do with
Yes.
ceramics is make and in Japan, with the way that they construct their companies and the way that their social kind of expectations, their social contract works, it's the company that diversifies into all of those things.
Yes.
And one of the things that results in is you work for the company basically you're expected to for the whole of your career, right?
Well, this is the, I mean, the general point here is compounding inside of a company in a different way. It's not just financial compounding, it's compounding with the knowledge, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I haven't explored this in too much detail, but I wonder how much innovation has been lost because the majority of workers, my day job, the way I make money is actually recruiting. So I spend a lot of time around talent, and the number of talent in the market who are genuinely interested in compounding their knowledge forever has
Mm-hmm.
basically gone to effectively zero. It's not zero,
Mm-hmm.
but it's so like the number of people who are genuinely interested in compounding their talents and skills is very low, right? I would say under 1% of the workforce because they're bored. They get bored so easily. They want something new. They
Mm-hmm.
can't focus. I mean, I have severe ADHD, so I get it. But at the same time,
Right.
it's like we need to have this amount of focus. And I think the companies can build the incentives because not only does the company benefit and the income, for the company benefits when people are compounding their knowledge, there's also the
Right.
institutional understanding of how the company works. You don't necessarily need to have all these, stupid HR policies in place and processes because people just know how things are done. There's an
Right.
institutional, I think the word is institutional knowledge, right? Where
Right.
you don't have to have everything written down and made so that somebody can pick up the mantle. And that's a good thing in a lot of ways, assuming that there's an interesting point here. When you do that, you as an employer are also putting trust into your employee that they're not going to leave. And then there's this dependency, right? When you have a relationship with your employees and you respect them as humans, as not just numbers, they
Mm-hmm.
feel that. By the way, this is the number one reason why people leave jobs is they just don't feel respected. But
Mm-hmm.
they feel that they're respected. So they have an interest and they have this relationship, even though it's not like necessarily friendship, they have a relationship with their boss or their
Right.
company managers. So they're less likely to want to leave and they're less likely to complain about having to make sacrifices for the company. I was in this situation with my last employer. Thankfully, I run my own company now. But at the same time, like I wanted to see this company win. I was willing to give up territory for another person to come into the team because I was very bought into the fact that my boss, he took a bet on me. I was, a kid with no college education. He moved me out to New York City and he bet on me. So I was
Right.
motivated to work for him, even though he was going to have a much higher outcome than I
Right.
did. So I sacrificed that. And this is the same thing with other companies. You build this relationship, the
Right.
employee is willing to sacrifice, and you have this implicit trust situation where the employee knows that I know things that would be really hard to replace, but because you are investing in them, there's this shared kind of tension where you stick around with each other to build something for the end. Hey everybody, here's a quick word about our sponsors. Our Father Constructors and Associates is a Catholic-owned construction and project management firm. If you're involved in a diocese, parish, school, or religious community, and you've got a building project on the horizon, you need to talk to Our Father Construction. They will help you fund it, build it, execute it, and make sure that the momentum keeps going from concept all the way through to completion. They should be your go-to construction project manager. They will choose the right architects, designers, and contractors, and they'll protect your budget, oftentimes finding you savings where you didn't even know they existed. And, of course, making sure that what gets built actually serves the church for generations because they genuinely care. They structure and manage projects all the way from $1 to $45 million. To learn more, reach out to ourfather.us or email Christian directly. And I can speak personally in saying, I know Christian, I've known him for a while, he's a very good friend of mine, he's somebody that I would trust with my life and my family. So reach out to Christian, that's Christian at ourfather.us if you have a project on the horizon and you want to make sure it gets done right. These guys will take care of you and they'll make sure everything turns out right and all for the glory of God. And tell them Silas sent you. Now let's get back to the show.
One of the points the reason I bring up the Japanese firms is, one of my bugaboos is when people say, well, basically, Greg, these ideas, they just require people that are more religious or more spiritual than I am, and I'm a normal person. I was like, no. I promise you, this is much more like an incentives problem than it is like a spirituality problem. So, I loved my grandfather. I mentioned my grandfather often in the things that I talk about. My grandfather was not a religious person. He darkened the door of a United Methodist church like once or twice a year, right? And he was able to manage all of these relationships incredibly effectively. So one of the big problems one of my grandfather's kind of basic rules of patronage, right? The first rule of patronage, according to, Ernest Burroughs, was something like never ask anyone to do something unless you know how much it's going to cost them, not how much it would cost you, right? And one of this gets into, there's kind of an ongoing conversation online about communication barriers across IQ levels. In my family, one of the great house attributes, and I would strongly encourage anyone who has great house ambitions to do the work to acquire this skill and then force your children to learn it, because I was forced to learn it around 12, right? When they noticed that I hadn't picked it up, just kind of natively from being around the family, was you have to learn how to model people that are not as intelligent as you, right? And if you are forced to do it, you can, right? If you are forced to say, okay, you got to sit there and you have to communicate to these people and you have to get them to do the job. You're not allowed to do it. You have to get them to do the job. And it's crazy making, right? For the first, week or so. And then your brain just sort of clicks in, right? And you get better outcomes, right? And there's a lot more to it than that. Again, at some point I'll probably do an episode on how to do that. But you can do that is the point.
Yes.
And you have to do that, right? One of the problems that people have, and it's just really a desire to avoid responsibility, is they'll have a wage negotiation in which the laborer who knows nothing, right, negotiates for a number. And then there's an economic shift like, I don't know, inflating the money supply by 40%, just to pull a random number out of a hat. Not that would ever happen because that would be crazy. Anyway, so you have an event, right? A big picture, somebody at the top of, who's pulling levers, pulls a big lever, and it dramatically shifts what the expectations are and what that dollar figure can actually buy those people in the marketplace, right? And you just say, well, that's not my problem. Okay. Will it be your problem when the guy's wife goes into depression and she leaves him? Will it be your problem when he becomes less, like, at what point does it become your problem, right? And this is kind of that We have to reacquire a mindset that says, if I want to be in charge, I have to act like I'm actually smarter than the people that I'm dealing with, that I know more, that I can predict things better, and that I don't just use that to rate economically all of the dumb people in my life. I use that to protect and provide and prophesy for those people, because I'm trying to image Christ, or whatever it is that you believe in. But for a Christian, right, like if what you do with your superior intelligence is just say, well, I'm going to win all the fights with people who I'm always going to win intellectual fights with, and I'm never going to use that intelligence to protect them from a cold, cruel, rapacious world. Well, then you don't deserve, I with respect, there's some people that have done great things, some funders that have done great things on the right wing, right? But I've consistently seen breakdown in relationships over amounts of money that mattered not at all to the funder, but mattered greatly in terms of the social status. Now, one of the other things, I did a whole episode, actually I'll probably have to do that again, because I did it in the private exit calls, not on the Great Houses forum, about status and how it's created, and how you have to create communities that create status. Because if you just try to buy status with money, it just becomes a snake eating its own tail, and you never get anywhere. Like, it becomes absurdly expensive to signal to a woman, hey, we have enough money that we're okay. You have to do status games, which is similar to, working with lower IQ people, is a skill that you're not taught anywhere in kind of modern America, but you have to have in order to be successful as a great house, as a patron. You have to be capable of creating status, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, the closest thing that I think that I've ever heard somebody talk about in terms of what my grandfather did is sort of like a Tony Robbins. How do you change somebody's state, right? He talks about changing state, and that's close. It's still not quite the same thing, but it's close.
Well,
So
one thing I'm curious about is with these people who are, not willing to recognize that they will face the consequences of not caring, for example, in the case you laid out before.
Yeah.
How quickly do you believe that in, let's say, the 60s and 70s and 80s, how quickly did people start to recognize the consequences of not caring versus now? Is the speed to recognizing faster? Because my gut feeling would be that most people, as long as they've built like a decent sized company, they can kind of get along for a while without caring about these things and saying that's not my problem for most of their lifetime, meaning, or at least most of the lifetime that they really have the energy to care, I should say. So once they start to get into their 60s, they probably just will not really care anymore. But if they don't have a next generation mindset, will they just never care? Or is that required to have this focus on investing in solving those problems for your employees?
Well, you have to have something that makes you ask the question, what do the numbers look like on a much longer trajectory than a 3-month trajectory? So there's a guy, I think his name is Rory Sutherland, I want to say. He's a marketing guy, great British dude, has these wonderful suits, kind of a hefty dude. And he's got a kind of a big YouTube, shorts or TikTok presence, right? And I don't know if he has it, or just people like love him on TikTok, and so they clip stuff out. I don't know. I have to do it that far. But he talks about, what are the other things that are going on, right? So you have the classic example. He tells a story about like hotel bellhops, right? And at some point, the quality control consultants, right, came along and said, well, life would be much better if we replace the bellhop, who's very expensive. He's like a human being with a salary, and salaries are going to the moon, right? Compared to like the cost of an automatic door. Now we've got these new sensors, these new motion sensors. Somebody walks up, the door just opens, right? Beautiful. Well, you do that, and then people report over time. Well, actually, the bellhop did like a ton of different things. A more modern, and now no one is doing those things, right? A more modern example would be Waymo, right? The taxi drivers. Apparently we're discovering taxi drivers did like a lot of extra things besides just drive the car. Who'd have thunk?
Not in New York City, man.
Well,
I fear for my life with those Uber drivers, man.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that's there's a lot to that. There's a lot to that. The taxi medallions, and there's a whole network of incentives that go into that, right? And then Uber comes along and undercuts some of those incentive structures, and then the other things come along, right? So the problem is none of those costs show up on a 3-month rolling, line. So they will never affect the quarterly stock price, because no one is, if what you do is say, okay, 3 months back, 3 months forward, I'm better off for having liquidated that guy, right? And then you come in and you say, okay, 3 months back, 3 months forward. Okay, maybe someone is, and you do that 3 or 4 times, right? Get a year down the road. Now if I do a year look, there's something going on here, right? People are less happy. This is impacting us in some way. So what if I reverse that? Well, what would that do? Well, in 3 month forward, 3 month back, I would be punished for that, right? I would always be punished for that.
For
And
fixing the
so
problem.
in a world where you have, outside consultants, McKinsey consultants who have to justify their salaries, right? And I'm not making any like I'm not criticizing McKinsey uniquely or saying that they have some kind of unique moral problem, right? They are brought in and they have to justify their salary on a particular timeline, right? And that's the terms of the agreement. And so when they say, okay, well, how do I justify my salary in a particular timeline? You're going to get those sorts of cuts, all right? And that's just how it is. And the same is true in a more muted fashion just in the company more broadly, right? You got a CEO who's going to be here for 18 to 36 months, right? And then he's going to take his golden parachute and float off, right?
Yeah.
And so that is the maximum time frame. I don't think anyone involved cares on a longer time frame than that, right? There's a few, genuine dividend chasing stock guys left in the system. Not very many. Like most, especially in a world where what the S&P index is like 50% of it is 7 companies or something crazy like that. I read that and I thought, oh my gosh, we are if the AI world has a hiccup, we're all going to have a much larger problem than I think we expect to,
Yeah.
especially because indexes are just the way, and no one is actually going through and saying, well, I want an index, but I want to dial back on the only part of the index
Correct.
that's growing.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, the thing I'm always curious about with this is, do you think that the stock market is just by nature the problem, or is it the people who are involved with the stock market are the problem? Because I know a lot of people will definitely talk about the value of liquidity being
Right.
offered there, but to me, it just seems that it's very, very difficult to measure things on any other metrics because that's the only
Right.
metrics that's actively traded. And just to reference one thing recently from the Pope's encyclical is he made a commentary that says focusing on GDP growth alone is the wrong thing because it misses the fact that there's other metrics or KPIs that should be considered, like human flourishing,
Like,
et
yeah,
cetera. So
or total fertility rate.
yeah, for example, those are all like other ways that we should measure it. So how do we solve this problem? Do we just like, does the stock market have to go away? Do we get rid of
So
quarterly earnings and make it
yeah,
yearly? Like what do we do?
so I think we need to recognize. So I have this framing that I've talked about in a couple of my podcasts. So I'm not sure how many of those you've listened to of democratic technologies, right? And there are democratic technologies, and then there are non-democratic technologies. Maybe those are aristocratic. That's kind of the term that I'm trying to put forward. That's the thesis that I'm testing. But there are democratic technologies, and the easiest way that I have at this point in time to explain what are democratic technologies is let's start with computers, right? They talked about in the dot-com boom, right, and bust. They talked about it's a good idea to invest in a business model where the answer to the question, what are we spending the money on, is we're buying more computers, right? So you have a business model that you can expand. If somebody gives you money, you buy readily available computers, slot them in, and then your revenue grows, right? Like if that's the pitch, yes, we're going to throw money at you, right? And we should throw money at you. And so I think there was a point in time, and there are always going to be certain technologies where the basic answer is just throw more labor at it, right? And specifically throw more mass labor at it, right? And this is what I think a democratic technology is. It's a technology that benefits from you have something that can be used or people can be trained in 6 weeks, 6 months, 2 years max, right? So you have either an uneducated person, or in these troubled modern times, because we really haven't had, I think, genuinely democratic technologies in maybe 100 years. So what we've done is we've tried to push what is a generally educated person so that we can get them to the point where they're productive. You go through some government funded education system, basically, right? Student loans, and then the public school system, right? Below that. And you get to the point where a generally educated person in that system can join in less than 2 years and be productive and justify their salary, right? And one of the points that I make is, there's a bunch of people running around saying that the fact that there's not going to be that they are equating a lack of entry level jobs with a permanent underclass. Okay, and I mean, historically, that's not true. Historically, for most of human history, we have had nothing that resembles an entry-level job except in farming, right?
Mm.
And so you see this play out, right? So I think what's going on here is we need markets to say, well, where should we allocate flows of short-term capital and short-term labor, right? And basically that 3 months should be, those are the kinds of jobs. We should do that for companies where the basic job is something you can be trained to do in 90 days or less, right?
Hmm.
So you get money from the markets, you hire more people, more labor, or you buy more computers, and less than 90 days later, you put those in, and that's how it is, right? Or you're
Mm.
pumping something out of the ground and you're shipping it around the world, and in less than 90 days, which applies to food and oil and all of these things, right? And in less than 90 days, you're selling it, right? Or you're holding it and you're playing some other kind of more
Hmm.
abstract, but you could sell it, right? If the price point were right, you could and would sell it, right? So those are the sorts of things that I think that public markets do well, and that describes very little about the actual like economic drivers of our modern society,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Do
even the
do you
hyperscalers problem, right? The problem is that the market doesn't know how to price these things because it's going to take too long to onboard us. We just, there are so many cycles between now and when we will get the information as to whether this was a good idea, that they're trying to divide by zero, man, and it's not
Yeah.
going well.
Well, do you think that this is part of the reason why we have seen fewer IPOs in, the past? My understanding is like the past 10 years, give or take, like there's been a lot fewer IPOs because people are already catching on to the idea that it's just not worth the downside of having
Right.
that exposure. Hey everyone, quick interruption to tell you about our sponsor, Monument Advisors. Tom Rooney and Matthew Molman aren't just financial advisors, they're Catholic business owners themselves, and they think about money the way we do, as something entrusted to us by God, meant to be stewarded, not accumulated. They work with Catholic entrepreneurs on everything, from building an investment plan around your values and family, to figuring out whether a retirement business plan makes sense. Most interestingly, they have access to opportunities in the private markets, which most advisors never even bring up. And for any of you who are currently Catholic Founders Guild members, here's a question. When's the last time that you took a hard look at the personal and family risks that you have left by the wayside, especially as a business owner? Tom and Matthew want to extend an invitation for an estate health check with their team. It's kind of like an annual physical, but in this case, there's no cold hands and awkwardness in the waiting room. This check is an easy way to uncover gaps in your overall financial picture and then take action to establish foundational estate documents that address those you care for. If you're married, your spouse will thank you. There's a link to book a call with them in the description. Tell them that Catholic Founders sent you.
Well, I mean, I think so. Part of it is that. Part of it is also just that many of the companies are able to make it work with consumers
Mm-hmm.
and non-retail investors, right? They're able
Mm.
to go and do private placements fairly efficiently. They're it's not like the New York Times doesn't or not the New York Times, the New York Stock Exchange is not the only one that can coordinate a funding event across the country, because they have a special
Yeah.
communication system, right? That
Yeah.
was absurdly expensive, right? That's just a thing of the past, right? So you can have a buying club that has 100 million or $100 billion collectively among the members, and they can just fund things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you get an idea, and well, okay, now that we've funded things, and now we're selling it to people who are paying us for a service or software as a service, and then we just why would we IPO, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't IPO in that point until basically you're starting to become commoditized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Until
Yeah.
what you do is so well understood, and there's a bunch of imitators, right? And so you genuinely can hire people kind of from off the street and just plug them into the thing that you're doing. And I see that a lot, right? But in
Mm-hmm.
the early stages, that these venture funds, right? And even now, I mean, there's just a bunch of venture funds that are carrying these companies that will someday, they hope, be productive, right? But there's a bunch of technologies that don't really resemble
Yeah.
a wheat harvest, right? Because a wheat harvest is another thing that you can work with, right? There, though even there, most of ag doesn't work with the way we have our modern markets,
Mm-hmm.
and that causes a bunch of problems. But
Yeah.
but let's say wheat harvest, you could make it work, and maybe you should. I don't know if you should or not, but you could. There's a bunch of things that are much more like trees, right? Where you get like a fig tree, right, where it doesn't produce anything for the first 5 years, or an olive tree, right, where it hits full production at 50 years in, right? Which that's I don't know if you followed the oil, olive oil scandals, right? Like there's a huge amount of adulterated olive oil just in the world right now because 50 years ago nobody was
Planting
planning
trees.
to have enough olive oil, and so there just isn't enough olive oil to go around. And so unless you are absolutely a super high end buyer who can exert enormous market power and basically punish people when you're in a position to do the chemical testing, and you can very much punish your suppliers if they fail you.
Yeah.
You don't get actual pure olive oil. Like there have been
Wow.
big scandals about stuff that's in Costco or even higher end stores. Like just very 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 hard to have any kind of national chain that can get you 100% olive oil because there's not enough, and so they just cut it with stuff.
Yeah, I see.
I mean, even in Europe, they cut it with stuff a lot of the time
Yeah.
because there's not enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's just this challenge of not looking long term. But the thing I would love to get your perspective on then is, let's say there's people, obviously people listening to this will probably be interested in this. Like, if they want to consider how can I build life for employees for my firm,
Right.
first of all, like what is in your mind the core benefit to them to do
Yep.
that, and then tactically, how do they increase the or increase the incentive to stay versus leaving?
Right. So I mean the core benefit is moving away from at will employment, right? Like from the perspective of the employee, right? What I want you to understand is that at will employment, however, is the necessary sort of balancing act in terms of the supply and demand of labor to the fact that most people, it's not worth it to pay that much to replace them, right? You can't have an insurance policy on your entire company, and all of your employees could leave at any given time, right? You can't retain them. So when you start looking for this, what you are going to find is offers that sound like giving up optionality, right? You're going to find places where the company is offering company housing, and you're just entering it. You're becoming extremely dependent, at least in the short term, on this company, right? So the problem is that that's kind of just necessary, because otherwise the company invests in you in the short term. You have not economically repaid the company back, and you can just leave at any time. You have the perfect legal right to leave, which, I mean, I'm glad that we don't have slavery in this country, right? But we have to acknowledge, hey, having the ability to just pick up and leave means that the other person, I mean, it's sort of like the fault-based versus no-fault divorce kind of a deal, right? And understanding that the way that stacks up with things like bankruptcy, right? It means that if there's no contractual penalty because that can be enforceable. I mean, it can be enforceable from a perspective of the contract holds up, but you say, oh, okay, well, I can't pay it, so I'm just going to declare bankruptcy, and I have no assets, so the company gets nothing. So you need to either be willing to trust the company directly and say there's going to be some things like housing and some kind of community element. There's something that I can't get, right? And I'm basically becoming extremely dependent on that company, at least in the short term. Or you need some kind of mediating institution, right? Something that serves as a guarantor between you and the company. And I mean, I think that's a lot of, like, when we talk about religious networks, that's a lot of what those guys are doing, right? How do you in a Catholic community get people jobs? Well, you get them because there's some set of expectations, maybe stated, maybe unstated, that this person will not behave like a typical employee. They will not just leave as soon as they've got some skill trained up. Or if they do leave, that will be viewed negatively by the community, right? We were talking. There's a guy that comes on my calls who's also Catholic. You talk about the old Catholic credit unions, right? And one of the things that happened there was you had somebody who had a mortgage to the Catholic credit union, and that meant that between the bankers and the priests, they worked really hard to make sure that this good Catholic boy always had a job, right? But the reason they were incentivized to do that is because that person had a mortgage, right? And
so you're saying that in using these financial incentives to, in a how do you say, like a morally acceptable way, to basically use that as the stake in the ground that says, hey, listen, because of this, we're all in this together, kind of thing. Like, we will help each other out. Not in a way that's like we're going to hold this over your head and it's usury. We're going to damage you as a human or treat you poorly. But hey, we got to work together, and you got to also hold up your end of the bargain, pal.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
it's essentially a penalty clause in a prenup, right?
Yeah.
Whoever is the first person to try to break this covenant, you have to start thinking about it covenantally, and you have to be okay with legal structures that act as though there's actually a covenantal relationship. If you're not okay with so there's kind of three framings, right? There's three maybe permission structures that people have, right? There's the economic permission structure. Is there enough resources to do this, right? Or does this activity produce enough profit to do this? There's the legal structure. Is there some deal that's enforceable that I can actually go to a court and get satisfaction from? And then there's the spiritual element, right? It has to satisfy my moral intuitions and be acceptable in whatever, hierarchy of moral values that I claim, right? So for anything, and you see this a lot when they're analyzing wars, right? People will talk about there's the economic reason why a war happened, there's the political reason or the legal reason why the war happened, and then there's the moral reason why the war happened, right? And usually when people, like, you see this in discussions of like the Civil War in the United States, right? Well, was the war about slavery, or was the war about, cotton tariffs, right? And the answer is yes, yes, and about, who was going to be in charge, right? Which was a Democratic was a Southern Senate, right? Going to be able, Southern senators, were they going to be able to effectively block a bunch of fairly significant changes that the Northern industrial elites wanted to make, right? One of those groups was going to win, and one of those groups was going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
And as is often the case when elites can't resolve things behind closed doors, we had a war over it, right?
Yeah.
And those are all true, and all three of them had to be present for there to actually be a war. If no one could make money with the war, it wouldn't happen. If there wasn't an outstanding legal question that we couldn't really solve, it wouldn't happen. And if there wasn't a profound moral disagreement, then the church would have been able to mediate it. So you have to have. And by the way, failing, the Presbyterian Church really did try to mediate the issues of the Civil War, and failing just wrecked them. Like they were broken as a cultural institution by the Civil War, and they never recovered. I mean, the death of Princeton, I think 40 years later, was just kind of the last, not the death of Princeton, but the fracturing of Princeton into modern Princeton University, and then what was called Westminster. That was just a continuing consequence of the death spiral that the Presbyterian Church had gone into after World War II, or after the U.S. Civil War. So you got to have an ability to solve the problems, on all different points in order to have a relationship. So when you come to someone, it's sort of, again, it's similar to marriage, and I overuse the marriage examples, but it's the only thing that we have left in our culture that we kind of think about covenantally, right? So to have a wife, right, you got to be able to provide for her, right? It would be a really good idea for you to have an enforceable legal contract that wasn't explicitly contrary to your beliefs, right? And you have to have a framework. You have to have a theory of what marriage is and what's acceptable within marriage. And you have to have some community around you that's going to give approval, affirmations, or not. So the same thing is true when you're talking about, because when we're talking about how do we have lifers, we're talking about something that's more like a covenant. Maybe it is a covenant, right? Especially if you've got explicit religious connection. Maybe it's just kind of a quasi covenant, right? But that's how you have to think about it. Like, does this work economically? Is there a legal structure that gives, and it doesn't have to enforce, and it can't enforce the whole relationship, right? No legal contract ever enforces the whole relationship. But the things that are enforceable have to give both sides some levers that they can pull, right? Mm-hmm. What people don't appreciate is, hey, the company is investing, when we do these lifer things, what makes it worthwhile for the company to take you on as a lifer is they invest heavily in training you to do something specific and idiosyncratic, right? And just in general, that's going to kind of constrain your options in the future, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you start your own business or something. But you have to be okay with that, them saying, in exchange for me investing a bunch in you, I need some levers on you, right? So that this relationship can be balanced. Mm-hmm. And what I say to people is, over time, you kind of work your way out of that, right? But if you're not willing to entertain a time and place where they've invested in you, they haven't gotten anything back, and so they want some legal thing to hold on to. If as a moral matter you say, well, that I just can't even entertain that, well, then you're not going to get this, right? That's the big thing that I see where good people, because again, the Japanese do this all the time. They're doing this right now. And we don't do it because we can't get all three of those elements present at the same place at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to an extent, as you say, a lot of these things, my typical apprehension, or my apprehension with most of this is that I think, take for example the regulatory industry in America. Like, the
Right.
regulations have made certain things safer. They're typically reactionary, so they don't really, like, they come in after the fact. But if you look
Right.
at it, people, Boeing has met the regulatory requirements, but their planes still fall out of the sky, right? Because
Right.
nobody cares anymore, right?
Right.
And I think that the personal, at least the way I view contracts, typically, I'm not a lawyer, but the way I view contracts is always that, like, this is just a bare minimum. Like, if things really break down personally between
Right.
us, then we'll have to resort to this. And obviously, it sucks when that happens, but it does.
Right.
So we need the contracts, but I always try to make sure that I even go above the terms of the contract personally. Because let's say I
Right.
have a client that wasn't really happy with the outcome, I'll give them a credit for the next search, right? Because I
Right.
just don't want there to be this breakdown. I want to, like, in some ways they're my patron because I receive
Right.
my funds from them, so I kind of defer to them. But that's my biggest apprehension is when you force these things. Like, you can have the contract in place, but you as an employer, even if you morally are like, hey, listen, like, that could be a little dicey. Like, I don't know if I agree with that. You could have them in place, but still choose not to enforce them if you really
Sure.
feel such, like, hey, this person, like, in their true situation, they needed to leave. Like, that I see
Right.
a reason why they weren't getting the benefit, or they were truly just
Right.
super unfulfilled, and it was, like, clearly a bad use of their God-given talents. I'm
Right.
not going to enforce the contract, and I can go to them and say, hey, I can clearly see you're not happy with this. That's where that personal relationship component comes in, and where you need to recognize the
Right.
humanity in everybody, regardless of IQ levels, right?
And people do. So one of the areas like where this is true and actually explicitly in the laws of most states, or basically all the states with a functioning agricultural society. I exclude California from this, of course. But so in many states there will be a provision for you to talk about eviction proceedings, right? So most evictions will take 30 to 90 days. This blah 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 blah. There's an exception though in almost every state that has a significant ag presence for farmhands who tend to get housing, right? And the rule is basically if you are fired, right, from your job, you have 7 days to get out, and that's it. Like that is the general rule that I've observed, and I haven't done a 50 state survey or anything like this, but as I've been a lawyer and kind of interacted with things, that's been a thing that has come up over and over again. Or there's some other like much more favorable, it's like, hey, you got 7 days to leave, right? That's the
And
law.
that's
Like they
to
can
the
actually
that's
they
to
can act
the
to the tenant, right? So
yeah,
if
but that's to the
you're a
provider of the
farmhand,
housing for the farmhouses, farmhands.
yeah, they can tell
Yeah,
the
got it.
farmhands you're fired and you have
Yeah,
7 days to
yeah.
leave, which is a very, very accelerated timeline. And if you
Hmm.
don't leave within 7 days, the farmer can have the sheriff come out and throw you out,
Hmm.
right? Like that is the law in most states. I've never heard of that happening, right?
Hmm.
Like,
If you're a Catholic business owner, you should not be building alone. Join the Catholic Founders Guild at CatholicFounders.com/subscribe. For $10 a month, you can join a group of Catholic founders who are dedicated to bringing the culture back to God. Don't build alone. Join the Catholic Founders Guild today.
I mean, the only times that would happen would be somebody that they were like a temp person and it really just wasn't working out. But people that had established, a lot of farmhands will work for their employer for 3, 5, 10 years. You tell me you're going to throw somebody out after 10 years in 7 days? This is not going to happen, right?
Hmm.
Like they took care of your family when you were sick, and they all these things, and your wife nursed their baby back to health when all of the right. There's all of these human connections that got formed, and they weren't a terrible jerk all the time, even though you might be firing them now, but there was some real affection. There was some good times there. You're gonna throw them out in 7 days. I've never heard of
Hmm.
that happening.
Yeah.
Right now they could. Right, they have the power. It's right there in the text of the law. I've just never seen a farmer do that. Right,
Hmm. Well, I
and
think there's something to it that if you make terms of an agreement where one person obviously
mhm,
without the agreement itself obviously has more power than the person
right,
who's, like, on the receiving end. If you make an
mhm,
agreement that is appearing to be equal, it is a lack of truth of the reality. Like, you're not
right,
acknowledging the reality anyway. So it's important to have
right,
those things, and then you can always, you can choose to give deference to them and still to be extra charitable
sure,
to them. Yeah. So
sure,
I guess one thing I'm always curious about is I like to look to the future law, and I just be curious of your perspective on if companies start doing this. Like I think a lot about this example of Ferrero Rocher, the company in, I believe I want to say it's France. He famously made sure that there was like transportation for his employees from the local
Right.
towns to his
Right.
factory, so they didn't have to move closer and they could, keep their more affordable house. And a
Right.
lot of their children and grandchildren ended up continuing to work for them in that
Right.
company. And I think that we could bring back this idea. That's part of the lifers thing. Is like you have almost this like genetic knowledge of the skill. I think there was an example Ben Black recently mentioned on one of his podcasts around this guy who had been farming or doing something particular. I think it was farming for 30 years, 40 years. And he said, yeah, but you think I'm good? You should see my son, who's only like, 15 years old. And he's
Yeah.
like, how is that possible? How could he know more? But it's because he's brought up in it from day one. But
Yeah.
there's that benefit to the employer, obviously. But I want to just understand your perspective. Let's say in America, like if we start doing this, if companies start investing in this long-term mindset, do you think that it's going to be very difficult at the beginning, but we will have the long-term advantage? And will it end up leading to other people following in our footsteps, even if they're not necessarily ideologically aligned with our worldview?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that we're about to see an enormous level of corporate level specialization where you're going to
Mm,
have idiosyncratic stacks. I think this is what so right they talk about the death of the app, right? Because software development is now so cheap with AI. So what that's going to mean is that there will not be a Slack. There will never again be a Slack.
mm,
Every company will have a chatbot that has been optimized for their particular company, right? They will have optimized, even if they're in CAD, they'll have optimized CAD programs that do exactly what they want and that kind of evolve over time as they have a couple of AI guys that just modify it, right?
mhm,
Continually. Right. And you accelerate that process by 10 years. And that means that every company now becomes like a world unto itself. Right. You can see this in like,
mhm,
biotech or some of the genetic engineering firms right now, where basically each company is a world unto itself, right? When you go, one of the problems they're having is these biotech companies will hire a PhD who's 35 or 33, right? Has $750,000 in student debt, has never worked a day in his life, has been in school for 20 years, right? And they get him in the building and they have to train him for another 2 or 3 years, right? Before he's
yeah.
productive because all of their machines are custom, all of their software is custom, all of their research is custom. No one else on earth is doing it. Google even has, like, for its algorithm, its core algorithm. I think there was this scandal, I think, at the tax world where basically Google was bringing over people, H-1Bs from somewhere else, and it was being creative in the way that it compensated those employees during their training time, which is a different subject. But their argument, which was a fairly valid, I mean, it's kind of an interesting argument to think about. Their argument was, well, and I don't think it was Google per se. It was like a satellite company. It was but it was for these algorithm based companies, right? So you got somebody who they're living in a penthouse, right? Or they're living in a nice apartment, right? The company provides their clothes, the company provides all of this stuff, and they're not paying them at all, or hardly at all, at least for tax purposes. And the reason they're not paying them is that, well, these people aren't economically valuable. We're training them, right? Because we have to
Mm,
train them for 4 to 5 years on what Google's algorithm is, because it's a trade secret. We don't tell anyone how our algorithm works. So that you
mhm.
can't go to university and learn how to get a master's degree in Google's algorithm or a PhD in Google's algorithm. Like, that would be crazy for Google to do that. So they have this kind of internal stack where they bring people in, they train them for 2 or 3 years, then they work for 3 to 4 years. And then at the end of that period, basically they give them a fairly large payout, and then they go back to, Southeast Asia or wherever, right? Or they don't, I suppose. But they leave Google's ecosystem at that point, right? Because they're, by the standards of their hometowns, stupendously independently wealthy, right?
Well, then isn't that still like in the negative outcome for Google, because then they just lost all that investment dollars? Or is that the point you're pointing out, that
I
they
mean,
still end up
so
leaving?
well, no, no. I mean, so they like there's different layers to this, right? But Google's point was, well, they didn't want to get taxed on a bunch of the things that they were giving these people in the first couple of
Mm,
years that were not cash, right?
I see.
But so and the idea was, and they do have some people stay, right? And you can kind of roll that in. You're sort of like with an investment group, right? You have the moment of, okay, you could cash out or you could roll into the next thing, right? And that's an important moment to kind of figure out what are people oriented towards. Anyway, the point being that I think that's going to be everywhere now. It's not just going to be
Mm,
Google's algorithm. It's not just going to be biotech companies. It's going to be everywhere. Every company Because the other thing that's going to quickly happen is it's going to become a job in and of itself just to learn how all of these optimized parts work. Right. And I think AI is going to drive that farther and farther and farther. Now, and there'll be some pushback. I think Microsoft will probably push back. I think some of these, but quickly we will get to the point of tribal knowledge. One of the other interesting things about tribal knowledge. Have you ever studied Dunbar's number? You familiar with that term?
I know the term, but I'm trying to remember
Yeah,
the nuances.
it's a fascinating thing. So that basically Dunbar's number is there's a certain number of friend slots that you have in your brain.
Yes.
Although they're not actually necessarily friend slots, they can be friend or enemy slots. There's a certain number of people that you have felt enough emotion at that your brain has assigned them a slot. And if they die, you will experience grief hormones, right? Your brain will release the grief chemicals, which is probably part of rewiring your brain. Because when you assign a slot to somebody, then your brain remembers a bunch of information that's relevant to that person in a different way than it remembers most information. Okay. So there's really cool things you can do with Dunbar's number. But the point is, it's like, 150 to 300 people and maybe like 75 on the low end. It's under 500 is the point. Like that is the absolute limit of this kind of brain-based tribal knowledge system. And less than 75% people, you tend to not need money because people just can track the flows of value, right? Under 300 people, you can have a fairly simple corporate structure with basically one captain and a bunch of squads, right? It's the company, right? Like as in the military company, right? Which is a captain plus 10 squads of 20, something like that, right? So that's the size that I think a lot of working groups will default to. And that's also, I think it will become efficient in terms of the marketplace, right? In terms of putting out good product, you will need to optimize your software stack to compete or you'll die, right?
Yeah.
But when you optimize your social stack, it'll mean that you can't swap people in and out willy-nilly anymore. And that's going to drive us towards this. So I think this is the greatest time in the world. I think that people like us with a religious frame, that third pillar, right, the spiritual frame, that should make us better what we are about to do than your average Harvard MBA. That would be my hope.
Well, yeah, I think I like that is very fascinating because there are obviously companies that they drastically from economies of scale. Like you think about Amazon. I don't think Amazon being a small company would be easy to do what they do. At least even if you just take like the marketplace only, remove all the other stuff, it'd still be very difficult.
Right.
But I do think it's a very fascinating time for those who are seeking to stop being corporate monkeys and to build their own companies, because you can build a highly specialized company in a niche that can serve people way, way better than anybody else ever could, because you can build specific software, you can build this institutional knowledge, and you only need to have, let's say, 15 to 100 employees to do a lot of stuff, have a good revenue, have everybody built up nicely.
And
the
same trends mean that now providing housing at 15 to 100 people is wildly cheaper. Providing utilities, clean power, water, sewage, internet, like all of that. You hit economies of scale at less than 200 people in an AI world in a staggering amount of industry, right? If Peter Thiel gets done what he's doing, right, down in Paraguay, like you might be able to hit an economy of scale for a nuclear power plant at less than 500 people. Like, that's kind of what makes that is the kind of thing that makes his small modular reactors thing economically viable. Now, will that happen? I have no idea.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, this was actually going to be my next question to you. Is that I've been thinking a lot lately about the importance of like localized employment and talent, because I hire overseas right now at the moment. It allows me to provide cheaper services to my customers than my competitors. It's my edge, but I really hate it. Like I kind of wish that I could have my people with me in the together, and I could vent about the things I don't like. But what do you think this will do to potentially rebuilding those small towns in America where somebody says, you know what, I've got the brains, I'm going to go invest in this small community that has nothing. They've been completely hollowed out, so they're willing to do anything. And if I'm willing to invest in them, I've got a little bit of capital to do so. I can acquire the clients from wherever. Our clients can be everywhere, but our people can be local. I could go to this town and become, in a pseudo king of this town, right? What do you think about this?
I mean, I think that it has never been more technically feasible than it is right now. I think the challenges that you're going to run into are legal challenges. First off, that's kind of how this will manifest, that there's some legal barriers to doing that. regulatory barriers. People in the system as it exists won't like it, right? Your local welfare bureaucrat will hate it because you're greatly decreasing the personal power of that, blue-haired woman. And so she will try to find ways, even if you're not actually violating the law or doing anything different than any other person, right? Regulations being what they are, you will attract institutional negative. All of those, I think, are basically solvable. Someone with my skill set as an attorney, all of that stuff is solvable, especially again in a world where compliance work. I just put out a Substack article where I said one of the key things that I see changing the balance of power is one lawyer with an AI application and access to his clients, data stack is going to be able to do all of the compliance work, right? Because the thing is, like, you don't have to worry about AI slop in compliance work. Compliance is slop by definition. It just has to technically comply with the requirements, but the more boring and kind of sing-songy and repetitious that it is, the better, right? Because the last thing that you want is bureaucrats actually reading it. Anyway,
I like that. I've never heard of that perspective. That's
so
quite
that
fascinating.
I think we're gonna, for small and medium enterprises, we're gonna blow the compliance barriers all the way down. There's gonna be a renaissance on that front. Where I think the real challenge is the spiritual front, right? There was a poster who asked in a more pointed and direct way than I will, why Peter Thiel is going to Argentina instead of to the Ozarks, right? And I think there is a real sense that people have that the spiritual, that you can't negotiate this covenant, that there's no way to bridge that gap between people with money and people that kind of are in abject poverty, right? Which is unfortunate. I think in many ways we're just sort of saying, well, the communists are basically morally right, and we're not gonna fight with them, right? But I do think you need a mental frame. You need a spiritual permission structure that says this is what a virtuous king looks like. And one of the ways that I frame this for people is, there's basically three feudal systems in the world. There's the Indus Valley feudal system, the caste-based feudal system. There's the Confucian, the Chinese collectivist feudal system, right? And feudal system just means an economy where like 2 to 5% of the people generate insane amounts of productivity, and everyone else generates like multiples, 10, 20, 100, 1,000 times as much excess as they need. And then everyone else generates like 10% more if you get them really hyper optimized. And a lot of people actually are net negative on the economy, right? At least. And when I say 10% more, I mean 10% more over their whole life. Okay. So there's no entry level jobs. People only become economically productive in their late 30s and 40s, and then there's this small group, right, who eventually by some means will develop a name that is, effectively equivalent to aristocrat. We won't probably call them that at the beginning, but it's going to be similar to aristocracy. And so when you have that economic system, which I think we're about to have in the AA world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then this is what it can look like. It can look like the Indus Valley. It can look like the Confucian, or it can look like Christian. It can look like Christendom. That's it. And if those are my choices, I vote for Christendom. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Does that make sense?
That's very clear. I like that framing. It helps me visualize it. I'm just curious if that is the case, right? And we have the majority, my understanding is the majority of people like really in charge of AI systems, for example, currently are not of the Christian leaning, right? Not truly.
Right.
Do you think that they will naturally end up like just becoming one of those three things automatically, or will they be drawn to one depending on the influence that they have? Because I'm wondering what's going to happen when this society takes shape. Are they going to say, well, I need a moral framework for this, or are they just going to like burn it all down because they don't have one? If busyness and admin work are keeping you from growing your business, it's time to call Paraclete VA. We connect Catholic business owners with elite Catholic virtual assistants worldwide to handle your marketing, finance, and busy work. How it works is you pay $500 on the day they start, and if you're still happy after 30 days, you pay another $500. Most roles take less than 10 days to fill. To get started, just email admin@catholicfounders.com with a little bit about what you're looking for so you can get back to doing what matters.
If we let AI, so there's basically a couple ways you can do it. If we let AI sort people, then you're going to wind up with some caste-based system. right?
Hmm.
Effectively. And I think, not to be crass, but I think that there's a number of people in tech that would find that a natural fit for some of their cultural priors. Okay? If we do an intensive kind of culture-based testing regime, right? Then you get the Confucian system, right? That's what the Confucian system produces. Everyone, all family, every family kind of puts out a person who gets tested each generation, and the effect of that test hits the whole family, right? And then kind of the Christian system is basically saying, hey, we are going to have spaces for other people to rise and to say, hey, we actually have a duty to take care of people down below us, right? They don't exist. The people on the bottom don't exist to serve us. They exist to serve God. And we also exist to serve God. Fear God, who is your master, and there is no respect. He's no, there's no partiality with him, right? That's a different kind of model. Now, there is an open technical question here. Okay. So one of the questions is, will AI be more like rice cultivation, right? Or will AI be more where you can have very large producers and they invest, and kind of the hyperscalers, they do these frontier models, and the frontier models are just incredibly better than everyone else. And we all wind up using Claude, right, in various respects, and somehow we're able to create a legal regime that prevents people from getting access to the underlying code of Claude and just running it on their servers, right? I'm not again, maybe that's possible. I don't know. The example that I would give is, it looks to me like AI and local hosted AI is going to be more like the horse. So one of the things when
Hmm.
you, and again, it's not one of the things I have to say every time that I mention horses. Writing an AI is not going to be like riding a horse. So the peak AI users, the AI knights, will not exhibit the characteristics that we associate with chivalry, because it's a totally different experience. It's a totally different kind of thing. Now, I have some hope, and there's some kind of interesting flickers from time to time, because AI is so malleable, that we might be able to produce a version of AI that actually could select for at least some of the same core psychological templates as the horse-based culture did, right? Which is
Hmm.
what chivalry is about. But I think AI will be very similar to in terms of the economic output, right? So the economic output is, you get the Normans and before them the Franks and the Saxons and the Goths, who are barbarians. They have very flat hierarchies. They have tribal assemblies. They come into Europe. They get access to a war horse, and within like 2 or 3 generations, they all look identical. They have a horse riding class. They have an artisan class that makes the armor for the horse lords, and then they have the peasants. And then the Italians send up some churchmen who eventually create a church class, but it's kind of fits and starts. That takes way longer. The horsemen, artisans, peasants happens super quickly, right?
Hmm.
Super quickly. And that happens to everyone who encounters the horse. And the reason that's able to happen is it was incredibly expensive to develop the initial breeding lines that could, with the horses that were strong enough to be armored and to carry a man in armor. But once those existed, it was way easier to acquire, and by acquire I mean steal, right? For the Normans to go in and steal horses, right, from the Franks.
Yes.
And then 2 generations later, they all had horses, right? And they were basically as good as everyone else's horses.
So, so is your take then that even though AI should be relatively inexpensive for pretty much everybody to access, you're saying that some people's AI will not be the equivalent? It'll be like, the equivalent of having no horse versus having a horse, because the true frontier models, which will be more difficult to access, will be the horses in this example.
No, actually, I'm saying that the skill of the user is what matters. I'm
Okay.
saying that a 130 IQ guy with access to the best frontier model in the world, fighting a 165 IQ guy running a local hosted, LLM, is going to lose to the 165 IQ guy,
I see.
right?
I see. So it's that everybody
Even
will
among
have a
people that,
horse,
right,
but not everybody will know how to ride it and use it properly.
right. Well, not everyone will be able to be a knight,
Correct.
right?
Yeah,
Like being peasants had horses, right? And horses pulling, draft horses, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Though, as I point out in one of my articles, like it took 400 years for anyone to care enough to invent the horse collar, which is what you needed to use to make the main horses that we had. We had all these great horse lines, right? And to it took 400 years for somebody to bother to go, oh, well, I wonder what would it take to make a horse useful for farming for the peasants, right? It was just way down. They didn't invent any new technology. It was just, carving wood and putting some leather around it, right? But it was not on anyone's priority list, so it didn't happen. All right.
Yeah.
And I when I look at the sort of the more democratic uses of AI right now, a lot of it seems to be driven by either direct Chinese releases or threats of Chinese releases. The Chinese are doing that for their own reasons. So I think that's kind of one of the things that I would say on that front
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
it's not clear to me that the people that are developing AI would care about releasing horse collars for the peasants, except that China keeps doing it, so they have to compete. Otherwise, everyone shifts over, right? That seems to me to be more what's driving that. But I do think that, I mean, I've seen I'm in a group called Exit, and I've seen people use local models to do things with that most people can't get a frontier model to do, right? Because
Yeah.
they're
Because they
smart and
have
they
the
know
brains.
because they know exactly what they're doing, right? And they
Hmm.
have deep knowledge of what a computer is and what a model is, and they have a context window that's about as big as the model they're using, and it just reminds me of, hey, you've got Norman knights with second rank horses, and they're beating the Franks and the Latins. They're
Hmm.
just slaying them because they are better at using the horses they have than those guys, right?
Hmm.
And so I mean,
Yeah.
again, I think that's the right way. It's to think about the economic impacts. It's not to think about what virtues will these peak AI users have, right? We're not going to go back to chivalry. We're not going to go back to kind of the romantic feudalism of the past. I mean, AI is malleable enough that if somebody with enough money tries hard enough, maybe
Hmm.
there's a way to do that. And wouldn't that be interesting? But that would be something that we sort of like, when European society decided to readopt Latin and Ciceronian Latin and all of that stuff, right? It took a lot of effort, and I don't think anybody was particularly satisfied with the result.
Yeah.
It didn't create the same impact that they were hoping for. So, but yeah, that's what I see. I see lots of idiosyncratic stacks, and I see just incredible power from smart people that know exactly what they're doing, being able to use this super sensitive force multiplier, right? And then on the other side, like, there is a democratic use of the AI. It's to say to the AI, "You're smarter than me. Tell me what to do," right? And we
Hmm.
might get to the point where everybody 115 and under, that's how they interact with AI. Here is my problem. I don't know how to solve it. Tell me how to solve it, right?
Yikes.
Hmm.
Yeah, that'd be rough outcome. That's part of the reason the Pope doesn't want us to just use AI all the time. Right? He's saying, hey, we can't outsource our reasoning. But I would like to
Yeah.
get your perspective on one last thing if
Yeah.
we have time for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is with this idea of, let's say, when we're covering the core things, right? We do life. Ideally, we get life for employees. We treat them well.
Hmm.
We make sure there's kind of this shared interest for the long term. We build these local communities. Do you think that this would then naturally, even if the leaders of these great houses or companies are not necessarily drawn to art and beauty, that it would naturally lead to the creation of more beautiful communities? Because this is something that really bothers me, is that we don't have beautiful houses. But we rent a house that's probably only, I think, it's 3 years old, and it's already like has issues, right? They just threw this thing
Yeah.
together. They're doing this
Yeah.
all over Nashville, and I'm just wondering if you think that would naturally end up as a result, because eventually other people will build these communities, and then they could choose to go to one that's more beautiful, that appeals to, now that my survival needs are met, I want to appeal to my intellectual, like the beauty around me. I'm curious if you have
Right.
any perspectives there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the beauty thing will happen primarily because you have people that are trying to keep their own children, right? So what I said earlier about culture and creating status, that beauty, and seems to me when I see it happen, it's because you have an established family that says, "Hey, I love my kids, and the best thing that I can give my kids is the continuation of this blessed charge that God has entrusted me with. That's been the fruit. The fruit of that has been all of the blessings, the material blessings that I enjoy. And so I want to make what I'm doing beautiful so that my kids stick around, because that's what's in the best interest of my children and what's most likely to fulfill my family's calling and kind of meet some kind of level of that's a necessary thing that I feel compelled to do for my kids and for my God, and then ultimately for my community, right? That I don't tend to see it be, I care about my employees, so I'm going to make beautiful things to
I
attract
say.
people from outside. It looks to me in almost it has that impact, right? It has that impact for sure. It looks to me in almost every case to be, I want something so that when my children. So have you ever hung out with foodies? You ever taken foodies to a restaurant and had them
Mm-mm.
immediately start talking about? You got to hang out with some more crunchy people, man. There's crunchy people in your community. One of the things that'll happen if you hang out with enough crunchy people is at some point you will have a group of friends that whenever you take them to a restaurant, they will spend the whole meal discussing how they could make it better, right? Like they could make this meal better at their house with their specialized tools. Right. And what happens is people get to the point where they don't want to eat out and their kids don't want to eat out. Their kids want to
Mm.
eat this meal made by mom with this tool, and that's the birthday meal that they want. They don't want the food
Mm.
from outside. They don't want to go to a restaurant. They want, like, if it's about food, like they might want to go out for the social element, right? Because it's prettier, because there's better art, right? But they don't want to go out for the food. And at a certain point, you'll sort of catch on to, oh, okay, well, the way to have my kids want to stay at home is for us to be better than what's available to my children to go out to, right? And so it's there's that old phrase, right? It's hard to keep them home once they've seen gay Paris, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
what you're fighting with. That's what most of these families are fighting with is, hey, and again, the message of hope that I would have is it's never been easier to do that, right? That there's several mega churches that I've seen in recent years, or I think since AI basically, that have started to put out 90s cinema level quality stuff on their just for their Sunday morning service or for events that they're doing. I mean, just incredible things, and my kids really like that, and they like it better than the slop that's put out by kind of the standard institutions, and that
Mm-hmm.
makes me happy, right? And I think that's where that's where you see the development of beauty is it's we want to keep the people that we already have. Now, if you do
Yeah.
that well, you will attract people from outside, but I've never, like, it's not quantifiable enough, it's not predictable enough for that to be a thing that you do. You do it so that you can keep the people that you already have, that you've
Yeah.
already invested in. And so it's part of how you create the lifers to begin with. That's not the lifers,
Yeah.
that's the how do we keep the next generation, right?
Yeah. Well, that was my perspective on it too, is primarily keeping people who have already, like, now that you've brought them in, especially if you do have
Mm-hmm.
this division of world where it's plebs and lords effectively, like you have these people who are now taken care of, and now if there are options to leave and exit to another community, they can choose to, but you can keep them.
Right.
But it's interesting that your point was, to me, that stood out, is that the actual challenge is keeping your own children engaged in the future, right? So
It always is.
preventing or finding a way to disincentivize their exiting of the situation.
And I'll say they're permanent exiting because you have to send them out. They have to
Yes.
go out, right? Every culture that I'm aware of no cultures that don't have some kind of a walkabout tradition. Every culture that abandons that tradition, it dies within 2 generations, right? You have to have some framing of, hey, we're sending you out to experience the world, to acquire something. Maybe you come back with money, maybe you come back with a company, maybe you come back with land, maybe you come back with a wife, whatever, right? You come back with something, right? But we want you to go out and we want you to come back, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we want you to go out and maybe you're in your late teens, and we want you to come back before you're maybe by the time you're in your mid-20s, and then start having children, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of the healthy progression is get out there and experience life, and there's that expression, sow your wild oats, and often that refers to kind of sexual impropriety, which that's I think that the healthy way for that to be manifested is go out there and experience life, drink a little, live a little, hang out with people, watch your friends, don't be an idiot, right? And sleep with the girl. Watch your friends sleep with the girl and experience, like, watch what happens there. Because you could just sort of, 2 or 3 years in a big city, watching your friends go through what normal urbanites go through. Like, if that's not enough to put you off the urban lifestyle, man, I don't know what is. Like, if you cannot
Yeah.
be totally drunk and totally, like, addicted to the lifestyle, which is another form of a test, right? I mean,
Yes.
that's one of the things that we're talking about here basically is, do you have the capacity to resist the addictions of the modern world? I heard this. I haven't chased this down, so if I think about this, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I'm gonna say it anyway.
Hey there, quick interruption. Before we get back to our guest, let's talk about stewardship. A lot of the capital allocators and investors who listen to this show tell me that they want to put their capital to work supporting other Catholic businesses. The problem is, finding those builders has always been incredibly difficult. That is why we launched a dedicated investor newsletter over at catholicinvestors.co or catholicdealflow.com if that's easier to remember. When you subscribe, you aren't signing up for a fund, an investment platform, or any kind of advisory service. It's simple. We publish a regular newsletter cycle that shares strictly factual, unhyped business overviews and metrics from active Catholic-led ventures that are looking for capital. There are no sales pitches, no transaction fees. It is a passive digital bulletin board delivered straight to your inbox so you can do your own independent vetting. If you want to see who is building in the ecosystem and seeking capital, go to catholicdealflow.com and join the newsletter list today. All right, back to the show.
I've heard this comment that basically one of the problems with chemistry, like in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, was that a bunch of people who learned chemistry would create something equivalent to cocaine and then just take cocaine for the rest of their life, their short life, right? And it took like a long time for us to figure out how to not have every chemist just be an addict of some kind, right? And then synthetic, the heroin and all of this stuff, right? Like chemistry, like one of the things that makes chemistry hard is not like learning how to do it. It's learning how to do it and having all of your top people not, be Brian, or was Bryan Cranston's character from Breaking Bad, right? Have not be the Breaking Bad guy, right? Either a user or a dealer, because that's the immediately monetizable thing for chemistry, right? And that was apparently a problem. Like it happened a lot, allegedly, in France and in Germany and Britain, all these guys that were discovering chemistry. And every now and then you stumble over something that's wildly addictive. And a lot of guys, their journey just stopped right there because they either made that for all of their friends or they made it for themselves until they died. And so, I think AI is going to be the same. I think the urban life is the same. So you have to send somebody out to test themselves against that reality.
And then it is a sort of selection bias too at the end of it, right?
If they can't pass that test, should we be putting them in charge of people's lives, right? Should we be like, again, structurally, I laid out for you, like there's these arguments. You have to give the guy that's in the top part of the hierarchy some lever, right? Otherwise, he's not going to marry you, right? For most of our audience, you're the girl in the relationship. If you don't give him some lever, he's not going to marry you, right? Just as we're seeing in many parts of the country right now, right? Many communities, like we've taken all the levers away from the men, and the men are saying, "Oh, well, then I'm not going to do this covenant because I have no levers," right?
Yeah.
So you have to give them some lever, but if we're going to give them that lever, we cannot have them be the kind of person that is just going to suffer from addiction, right? That is going to give in to that. It's always a temptation, right? But there's the most addictive thing in the world is power, right? Yeah. And that's still true. And our faith has been warning about that on a fairly regular basis for a long time now. So I think we have to acknowledge that. We have to recognize, okay, that is still true. That is still what we have to contend with. And if we want to do this, well, as Aristotle says, to Alexander the Great, how do you lead men? Well, be better than them, right? So you have to be the kind of person who is not going to fall into addiction in order to be worthy of leading these people. And that's just that's the selection.
Well, it's also very interesting though, because some of my friends have told me about this fact that, if I'm not mistaken, that the majority of great men have the very easy tendency to fall into addiction, right? So in modern times, oftentimes if they don't curb that, if they don't direct that energy correctly, they'll end up being addicted to video games or to drugs or other sorts of lifestyles. But they need to apply that in the right way. So it's like we in some ways we know that they have the tendency, but they have to be able to steer it properly.
Well, I don't know if that's true. I think that one of the things about great men historically was that they were always being asked. So I hung out with a descendant of an ultra high net worth house for 3 or 4 weeks while we were accomplishing something, and he would get propositioned by women multiple times a day, and some of them quite attractive women, right? And he said yes way less than I would have at that time. Does that make sense? I think you have to have that. You have to have that. So I think when we look historically, the reality was that they just had access. And the problem, of course, is that now everyone with a phone has access, right, to all of the world's, unearthly delights. right? And that's again one of the problems with our society. So I don't know that it's necessarily that different. It's just
Hmm.
it's the same, but they have to go through that trial. And all of the great men of the past did go through that trial. I think our in earlier cultures we did a better job of making sure that if you gave off lots of signals that said you wouldn't pass that trial, you just were not giving the opportunity, right?
Hmm.
You were told, marry Snaggletooth across the way and count your blessings, young man, and
Yes.
you were happy, right, with that. And now, it's not just the women on Instagram, it's the men, right? We are all faced with this, and I think that's one of the challenges that we have is we have to be okay. Think about spiritual permission structures. When you meet people that are genuinely meeting this standard, you will feel inferior, right? And if that makes you mad, then you're not going to be able to build anything productive,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Like you and what I've seen an unfortunate amount of the time, and I know it's going to keep happening. I'm going to keep watching this happen probably for the rest of my life, is people will find somebody who is genuinely exceptional, genuinely meeting a standard of nobility that qualifies them to be in leadership. And they have another person in their life who has some like fatal, tragic flaw that they're giving into their flesh. And they pick the guy with the fatal flaw because he makes them less frustrated. And then 3 years
Mm.
later, of
Yeah.
course, their life has crashed and burned because that guy's life crashed and burned because he wasn't qualified for the position that he gave them, right? It's like the women who marry the beta, right? And when you get that, you're not happy, right? Like
Mm.
you're just not happy. It doesn't get you what you wanted. And we look at the women and we say, well, this is very predictable. Okay. Like you should have known this about this guy when you got
Yeah.
in bed with him. And I see a lot of business, I see a lot of people, even Christian people, doing that same thing, that when they meet someone who is genuinely exceptional, that they have a problem with him, right? That that
Mm.
that that makes them less interested in trying to build a life with that guy, and trying to draft in his train. And I mean, like I've been successful to the extent that I've been successful because when I meet somebody like that, I press in. I'm like really excited by a guy that isn't obviously disqualified from the position of leadership I'd like him to fill, right? I
Hmm.
mean, that's
Yeah.
that's pretty much it, right? In terms of I've made a bunch of mistakes in my life, and I've chosen correctly on that front on a series of occasions, and that's why I've gotten as far as I've gotten. So
Hmm.
I'm very that's kind of my
Yeah. I mean,
framing and my thought on that.
it's the same thing with all of the startups. I see a lot of talent who end up only spending 1 or 2 years at a company because the company just keeps folding because they chose the
Right,
wrong. They just can't find the right founder. They don't
right.
have judgment to identify when they're looking at the right founder too. So now I definitely see it across other things. But man, I knew this was going to be informative. But this is really good. I appreciate you having this discussion with me, man.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll talk more in the future. I'm sure. All right.